Yes, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. I wish I could be there in person, but after driving around for 40 years, it's like, nah, I've had enough of that, especially the 401 in a blizzard. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about auditing today and animal welfare assessment. So for those of you that don't know me, I see that there's at least three people from my class, so they're going to find this really boring because we've already talked about a lot of this stuff. But I've worked for a long time, over 39 years. I've worked in sort of in this field of animal welfare inspection, animal welfare auditing, assessment. I spent 33 years with the provincial government, so with the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. I started out my career, I inspected riding stables and dog pounds for about 22 years, as well as I inspected research facilities that used animals, farm animals specifically. I did those inspections. For the last sort of, then I guess I did a vet tech program at at Centralia College, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now at Ridgetown. And then I did a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology at Western because I had no other choice because I live in London and that's all I could do. So I took that, and then one day I met Tina Wadowski outside the department, and she's like, you should do your master's in animal welfare. So I started that in, I think it was 1999 or something. And so I did my master's, and I also at that time I met Temple Grandin, and she's like, you should go do work on slaughter plants and that. So I ended up doing a master's degree, looking at assessment, working in slaughter. And the last 12 or 13 years with the Ministry of Agriculture, I was the Humane Standards Officer, and my job there was primarily monitoring and assessing animal welfare in slaughter, training meat inspectors. I also did lots of work on humane transport, regulated the sales barns, did lots of different things, worked with the codes of practice, helped develop assessment programs like ProAction and the pig audit, etc. And worked a lot with the mink industry. So, and then as part of my master's project with the University of Guelph, I wrote a course on how to assess animal welfare. It's for a special project. So when they started up this master's by coursework, they asked me, hey, do you want to teach your course? And I'm like, yes, that'd be great. So I've been teaching that. This will be my 13th year teaching that course, practical animal welfare assessment. Really, this talk is sort of like a commercial for that for that course. But I really super enjoy that. It's great working with the students. I always learn a lot from the students, and I think it helps me be a better trainer because I do, so especially since I retired, I do lots of training, and you kind of get used to training people that are sort of know everything, and sometimes it's harder to kind of back up and say, well, you have to present everything in such a clear manner so that everyone understands it. So yeah, so I did leave the ministry in 2016, and I started doing third-party audits for a company. Actually, I do third-party audits for 2 or 3 different certification bodies. And of course, before COVID, I was really fortunate. I got to travel, do third-party audits in almost every province, including, I think the only province I wasn't in 2019 was Alberta. But also all in the States, all over the States, as well as I did some, like my first audit, they sent me to Jamaica to do a chicken audit there. I also did some audits in Hungary. So that was really, really interesting. So I do lots of third-party audits. I still teach at the university. When the Minister of Solicitor General took over the cruelty legislation, the provincial animal welfare legislation, I started working with a lot of former colleagues there and been doing some training for the PAWS inspectors. We just did a project where we trained a bunch of inspectors on African swine fever, on pig behavior, and on different methods of euthanasia for pigs in the event of African swine fever. I also did some ISO 9001 lead auditor training, which was really interesting, and I really super enjoyed that because it looks at management systems, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'm also a Cal Signals Master Trainer. again, before COVID, I was sort of doing that. Of course, that all died out during COVID. So I haven't done too much of that, but it's a really interesting program with a sort of different approach for training people about animal welfare and assessment, which something that I don't know if you guys know Lena Levinson, but her and I are always talking about, we need to do something with cow signals that we can incorporate some trainers in there. So I've been doing this for a long time. I guess basically that's the bottom line. But tonight I just wanted to talk a little bit about assessment programs, auditing programs, why this is important, why this is sort of done, and then how we measure animal welfare in these different programs. And then I'm just going to review just a couple of animal welfare assessment programs that I'm familiar with that are maybe just a little bit different from each other. So we'll go through those. So really, I don't know if Tina's on the call, but Tina Wadowski, we've worked a lot together over the years. I've been really fortunate to, really I could say that, she's sort of responsible for me being here. So she's like, oh, take your master's degree, and that's one thing led to the other. But these are something that Tina and I talked about many years ago, sort of at the cusp of animal welfare assessment, jumping from being in the laboratory to being on the farm, at the farm level. And so one of the main drivers for that was at that time, and still is even more so, I'd say now with all social media and everything, is consumers and animal welfare. So, you all know the history behind the 5 freedoms and the Bramble Commission in the book that sort of launched consumers and being aware of industrial agricultural practices. So that was sort of the launching of it, Ruth Harrison's book. But, it's really sort of picked up pace over the last couple of years as people become divorced from actual food production. They hear a story, they go into to the store, there's something on, undercover video, they become concerned about animal welfare. They turn around, they talk to the government, and they also talk to the different industries or consumer or retail, Loblaws, McDonald's, those kinds of folks. They say, yes, we're concerned about animal welfare. So the animal welfare assessment programs came in to kind of provide that assurance to consumers that animals that are raised for food are treated in a certain, according to some specific standard, whatever that standard is. So, and really, the whole animal welfare assessment programs, the way they're sort of developed, the way the auditing has gone, really sort of parallels the food safety system as well. So it was probably about 30 years ago that, food safety, again, people getting E. coli and different salmonella from from products that weren't handled properly, that led to food safety programs, food safety auditing, assurances to the consumer that this product is safe to eat or whatever. So, and you'll see that if you start looking on labels, the lettuce that you're eating has been washed 2 times, not just once, but it's been washed 2 times. And that's really just a food safety component. So animal welfare, about 20 years later, just parallels this whole development of the food safety when it comes to farm animals anyway. So again, like consumers and animal welfare, there's a million of these different sort of surveys or polls. You ask folks about, do you care about animal welfare? This is a survey that was done, Angus Reid. It's kind of old, but it's 13 years old, but I have some other ones I have one from yesterday that I'll show you, but it's the same sort of question. You ask consumers, do you care about how food is food that you're eating or using for clothing or for entertainment or for research? Are you concerned about this? And most people will say no, as long as there's no unnecessary pain and suffering, right? So, or unnecessary pain and suffering are minimized, or avoidable pain. There's no avoidable pain or suffering. So, and that's when you start looking at regulations, and we talk about this a lot in my class. This is what a lot of our regulations. This is the actual wording that's in a lot of the regulations, including the provincial animal welfare legislation. So really, you can use animals as long as you don't cause them unnecessary pain and suffering. folks at the University of Guelph, like Tina and Georgia and those and Renee and those sorts of people, all the researchers, their research is really informing what is, what's painful, what's unnecessary painful, and, and then in some instances looking at, how do we mitigate that? What kind of pain medication? When should we apply pain medication? What's a good level? So that's, this unnecessary pain and suffering, that's sort of at the debate, the middle or the center of the animal welfare debate, is that what's unnecessary pain and suffering, what's avoidable? Well, we shouldn't be doing those things once we've identified that. Again, this is one of, some of the work that I did with Tina for a long time ago. Really, when we talk about, consumers and animal welfare, that, that we really have to, you have to separate the consumer. Something's gone weird with my slides here. I don't know where that picture came from. It's supposed to be on the next side. The next slide is really just consumers and the citizen duality. So as a consumer, when you go to the store, are you thinking about animal welfare? No. You can ask anyone, in any sector when they're trying to sell a higher animal welfare product like cage-free eggs, or, talk to Tina about cage-free eggs, that citizens, if you ask people, do you care about animal welfare? Well, of course, they're going to say yes. And they'll also say, and I'll show you a paper about dog food, that people will say, yes, I'll pay more for higher welfare certified products. But as a consumer, that just doesn't play out. So especially like in the last year, we've had super high inflation. So, groceries are really expensive. Big issues in the US with the eggs, price of eggs have gone up like 900% because they don't have supply management. So people are now, we're all going to get hens and raise them in our backyard. So that's sort of the, when they talk about animal welfare, and you look at a report like this that says, yes, we care about animal welfare. When it comes to the bottom line, the consumer acts quite differently than you would do as a citizen. So that's called the consumer citizen duality. So here's a paper. So I showed you something from 2010. Here's a paper that just came out yesterday. So here we're looking for quite an interesting thing. That's why I showed it. So it's about, can dogs help chickens? So they're looking at pet owners' willingness to pay for animal welfare friendly pet products. So that means if you can have, I think they're looking at certified chicken in their products. So if you have like hens in your dog food that are from in free range production, you're going to pay more for your pet food. So again, they all said yes, they will do that. But when you get to the store, to the consumer, to the grocery store, people are not going to buy it because they're going to go, oh my gosh, it costs, $65 for a little bag of dog food, and they're going to buy something that's cheaper, especially if they, if they're out of work or, or a minimum wage or something like that. Interestingly, they didn't see a difference with income, but I mean, that it just doesn't play out. Like when I go shopping, I'm always looking for people in the store to talk to about, ask me anything about the label or whatever. And like no one that I think I met one woman one time that was interested in how the different eggs are produced. Most people are just looking for, what's the cheapest or whatever. So unfortunately, those surveys, those surveys, they're interesting, but they're not really what drives animal welfare. A lot of what the consumers are looking for is just that assurance that, animals are raised to a certain standard. So, and I'll talk about standards, what people are looking for assurances around. So the other thing too, and I know you guys have all done animal welfare, so that, trying to define an animal welfare, what animal welfare is, that's a whole other lecture. Which people like Renee and Georgia are much better qualified to talk about than I am. But, I always find it interesting when you ask people, what do you care about animal welfare? And we did a little project couple of years ago, and we asked people the same sort of thing, do you care about animal welfare? And then you ask them, well, what does it mean? Well, they don't really know, but they still really care about it, and they have certain beliefs about things that they want to see. This is one study out of China that just said here they're looking for animals to be more they were more concerned about the welfare of wild animals, as well as, you know, that animals have be able to do live in the wild and be natural or whatever. So they were concerned about animal welfare. They really had a sort of focus on wild animals, and so that's sort of interesting. So that, you know, so one of the reasons definitely is consumers, and, you know, every undercover video just kind of drives that point home. So you know, some programs may have been developed, you know, in the 90s to kind of answer some questions for consumers and just give them that assurance that animals raised for food or used for, you know, in the rodeo, the Calgary Stampede has a program just to, you know, to assure consumers and verify for them that there's a standard and it's being met. It's being met consistently, and there's third party eyes that go in and kind of verify that. So there's also other reasons beside the consumer. You know, that's just for regulation, right? So I'll talk about that. In Canada, we have lots of regulations. They're mostly cruelty regulations or avoidance of cruelty, but still someone, CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the provincial animal welfare people, their job is to go in and make sure that animals are being handled or trained or slaughtered according to that regulation. So they need to measure welfare. For other reasons or marketing advantage, you know, some of the higher welfare groups, you know, Red Tractor, you may be heard of those. That's sort of the oldest animal welfare group. So they sell their product in the store. It's a bit higher cost, and they provide they have to provide that assurance that yes, these animals are raised to that higher standard. You know, those farms are audited every 15 months or so. The other thing is trade. So it's not a trade barrier as far as the WTO goes, but there's a lot of equivalency that goes on between different countries. And if you've paid attention, and maybe not, you haven't paid attention to what's going on with Brexit, the British public or those folks involved in animal welfare are very concerned that they're going to have to sort of sacrifice their higher standards in order to be able to trade with some of these other countries, since they're not part of the European Union. So that's a big part of why we measure animal welfare. And then the other piece around animal welfare assessment programs and why we measure welfare would be for continuous improvement. So really, in the early days of a lot of programs, they were sort of sold as being a way for farmers specifically to, you know, kind of measure what's going on right now, provide some different inputs or do some different management practice. And then over time, they could sort of measure through animal welfare for things like body condition score, lesion scores, et cetera. They can measure the impact of their programs, so of their changes. So that's the continuous improvement program. Was certainly at the outset of why programs were developing and why we measure animal welfare. So if you're starting up a new program, you know, so you're going to, you know, license riding stables or something like that, for example, that would be one of the big selling points for people to kind of sign on to a voluntary program. Why would I join this program? Well, it's going to give you a way to measure improvement, right? Continuous improvement. So, you know, and just like Temple Grandin always talks about, you know, you manage what you measure. So that's one good reason to measure animal welfare. And I was actually at a dairy farm last week, and, you know, I think these people came from another planet, but they, you know, they're like, that's why we do this program, because we want to know, you know, where the gaps are, and we want to identify those gaps, and then we want to make changes, and we want to be able to you know, somehow qualify those changes. So there's lots of folks that sort of think along that way. So when we talk about animal welfare in general, you know, in North America, we have lots of North America, maybe South America, Australia, maybe not so much, but we have lots of different animal welfare programs that are developed and implemented and sort of regulated by the industry. Where if you look at Europe, the EU, they have a lot more regulations, right? So it's regulated by the European Union and by each member country. So 20 years ago, I would have thought that, you know, with all these regulations, that Europe is farther ahead as far as it goes with animal welfare. But I think that with the implementation of all these programs that they're called voluntary, but they're really not, because if you're a farmer in North America, specifically, you have to be on at least one baseline program. But I mean, I go to farms and farmers are on 2 or 3 different programs to kind of meet requirements for different customers. So when we look at, we look at the science and the work that's come out about what's unnecessary suffering. So in Europe, they have a regulation that they ban something or they change something. Here in North America, these same sort of changes are being made through these industry-driven, different, just a different approach to animal welfare and animal welfare assessment. So in a lot of things, so not everything is we haven't really caught up, but I think at the end of the day, sort of the outcome, we look at things like sow stalls. So I know that there's some issues around that with the Pork Council, but we have made that here in Canada. We've made that realization that we need to move away from those, through the industry approach. So I think the animal welfare assessment programs, they have a bigger role to play in North America when it comes to kind of improving animal welfare through the implementation of those programs. So really, when we look at all the different programs out there, and there's many of them, really, when you're looking at program, or if you're writing a program, when you sit down to write a program, so a lot of people just think, well, you just make a checklist, or you just take a code of practice and you make every standard in the code of practice, you put a question mark at the end of it, and then that becomes your program. But really, whatever your goal of your program really determines what aspects you want to measure and how you want to measure those things. So if you're looking at a regulation or regulations specifically, because they're very vague, then what aspects of those are you going to measure really becomes sort of problematic, because something says sufficient feed, that can be a lot of different things to measure. Codes of practice are what when we specifically look at farm animals, that's sort of our emphasis here in Canada. But sometimes some of these program goals are just to measure, things that are just sort of common practice, just to verify that everyone's sort of doing that. So as I said earlier, many countries, including North America and Canada, we have legislation that we're measuring animal welfare. That inspectors are measuring animal welfare. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, they are looking at humane slaughter and the Safe Food for Canadians Act that just came out a few years ago. And they actually require that slaughter plants have an auditable animal welfare program. So they don't just say that they have to have an animal welfare program. They have to have one that has KPIs in it that they can measure, that they can monitor to verify that they're meeting their program goals. So, and the Health of Animals Act is another area, especially around animal transport, and then disease control, which is avian influenza and African swine fever. Again, we're measuring animal welfare at humane transport. There's a lot of work that goes on there. So when we're looking at standards of care, other standards of care in Canada, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the codes of practice, right? The codes of practice are commonly, they're the reasonably and generally accepted practices for all the farm animal species in Canada, and a part of the program that it is administered by the National Farm Animal Care Council is not only to write or revise the codes of practice, but also to develop programs on farm animal welfare programs that verify that the requirements in the codes of practice are being met. So this is a big part of what I do. It's a big part of what I've been involved in over the last 20 or so years, developing these programs based on these standards of care. So the codes don't say what you're going to measure or how you're going to measure it, but they're sort of like, these are the expectations. These are the outcomes that we want to see when we go on farm. So basically the same thing. So that's one. So we have regulations that are used as standards. We have codes of practice, and of course we have the 5 freedoms that developed by the out of the Bramble Commission by the Farm Animal Welfare Council in 1979. So the 5 freedoms, so that describe the state of the animal, right? So these aren't really standards of care, but there's a lot of programs out there that have been written and developed using these sort of as their standards, right? So these are, I mean, the codes of practice here in Canada originally, and when the first one came out in 1980, that was based on sort of the 5 freedoms, because at that time there were no requirements in the code. It's like, well, what are we going to assess in here? Well, what are we going to put in our program? Well, let's look at the 5 freedoms and make sure that what we're focusing on is based on meeting those standards of care. So the 5 freedoms today, there's enough other standards that are out there that, you know, but they're still mentioned in, you know, they're still mentioned in a lot of programs as sort of the foundational, you know, we want to make sure that we're covering these things when we're writing our program, when we're sending people on farm or people into a research facility or wherever to measure animal welfare. We want to make sure that we are making sure that the 5 freedoms are being met. So still really important, really relevant when it comes to animal welfare assessment. So again, I mentioned this earlier. So how do we write what's in the standards, right? So here at the University of Guelph, that's what, you know, there's so many people, excellent researchers, current and past, and you guys are the future, that you know, part of your job will be looking and doing research, preference testing, motivation testing to kind of figure out what are the things that should be in the standards, you know. So these are just some slides that I got from Tina looking at, you know, hen behavior, what sort of things are they willing to work for. This is, you know, some work done by Gail Eckert looking at, you know, training a horse to do a T-maze, to do that sort of preference testing. Oh, I didn't realize that was a video. So anyway, so those are the kind of things that are really super important that are being, you know, that are work that's being done. And all these, you know, some of these research projects might seem, you know, not very practical or relevant, but all these research projects go in to write codes of practice, to inform regulations, right, on how to, what do we need to include in the regulation, what sort of wording, specific wording do we need to include. And so, you know, past regulations, past codes of practice had vague, and my students in my class, we did a project on this just before the break, you know, looking at all this, so much words that are written, but they're not very practical, and they're certainly, you can't audit to them or assess them because it's just words like sufficient or adequate that are you know, are very vague and hard to measure. So this is what, you know, all this research that goes on here, you know, is really super important, just feeding into these standards of care, whether it's a regulation or a code of practice or whatever. So that's some of the reasons why we, you know, some of the standards that we look to, and really when it comes down to these animal welfare programs, and I'm sure you guys are all familiar as well with these different approaches to animal welfare, the biological approach, feelings approach, the natural living approach. When people are sitting down and kind of looking at a program, and when they're thinking about their goals of the program, so what do I want to achieve when I write this program? So sort of where they fit on this in this Venn diagram. So if they're more like on the biological functioning approach, when they write their program, they're going to be more looking at, you know, mortality records and, you know, feed gain ratios and those kinds of things, you know, disease, mortality, morbidity versus how are the animals feeling, right? So you can really see that when people are developing different programs. So we just had a talk this week with, because we're working on a project looking at a global review of dairy programs. So we were talking to a group out of Austria that developed a program called the Animal Needs Index. And their approach was really, they were really from the natural living approach. They just wanted the cows to get outside. So when they wrote their program, they had, you know, I think it was 500 points, but 300 of those points were based on whether or not those cows got out for a sufficient number of times. So you can really see that when people sit down to write a program, how they're looking or where they kind of fit into these 3 approaches, that really sort of determines the outcome of their program. So really, you know, the best program has a bit of each approach. So some natural living aspects that you can fulfill, looking at how the animals feel, of course, and then also some biological, taking into that the biological functioning of the animal is also really important when you're developing a program. But I mean, in real terms, it's really not. People kind of sit on one side of that diagram versus being in the middle. So when we're talking about programs and how to write them, and I always mention that is that, you know, when you're writing a program or standard, and this slide, like this seems like something really easy to do, to write a good measure that's not vague and doesn't have words like properly or adequate or sufficient, to have really clearly written standards. But you know, it's really quite difficult. You can ask anyone that sat on the code of practice or has written a program. So you want to write something that I can give to 10 people and they can go on a farm and they can verify it. Not easily done. Here's an example of a clearly worded guideline from Temple Grandin. So, you know, all pigs must have enough space to lie down without being on top of each other. So that's the guideline. So we can look at the pigs on the left and say, is it meeting the requirement? Right? No, it's not. And then we can look at the pigs on the right and say, yes, it is meeting the requirements. So that's the kind of guidelines that, you know, that people, when they're writing these programs and when you're out on a farm doing a verification, you know, these are the kind of guidelines that you need. But we know from my class that, you know, I think several of the students count up like, oh, and they would say that, oh, here's a standard for dog kennels, and said properly 72 times and adequate 86 times. Like it's still hard to be specific, because for many things there's various ways to kind of, you know, provide sufficient food, water, space for animals. So it's quite difficult sometimes to write a good measure for these animal welfare assessments. So we look at, I don't know, does anybody have any questions up to now? I can take questions as we go along.
We don't have any right now.
Okay, good. So when it comes to actual programs, so there's several different ways animal assessment or audit programs can be set up. So there's some very simple checklist programs where it's just like 2 categories. Yes, it meets it. No, it doesn't meet it. And I'll talk about Temple's program that she developed for the slaughter plane industry, which was basically a yes, no, but very simple program. So, and then counting or scoring of different criteria, which is also, you know, providing a percentage is very common as well. There are lots of indexing systems that are either overtly indexing or inadvertently indexing. So as I mentioned with the animal needs index, they make it very clear that they're weighting access to outdoor to pasture, and they give, you know, they're very clear on that if your cows aren't out on pasture for 120 days or whatever it is, then there's no way you're going to be certified. Then there's other programs that don't actually say that, but when you start looking at the scores that are provided for or given to each questions, for example, if you don't have a euthanasia plan, it's 50 marks, and you're going to fail the audit. But they don't actually say that that's not part of their information. So, but there's lots of different index systems that give weight to certain things that, again, these are the things that the people that write the program, they feel these are things that are really important. If you don't have this, then you're not going to be, I don't feel comfortable giving you some sort of certification. Really, as I said, I meant to put a little plug in here for ISO, for the International Standards Organization. So they have sort of an auditing system called Quality Management System. So that's ISO 9001. So their systems are designed that when you do your verification, you're really looking at the system that the company, the farm, whoever has developed, making sure that it has all the criteria that's outlined in the standard, but then you're also verifying that what they've written in their standard is actually being done on the farm or in the plant or whatever. So that's kind of a newer quality management system for auditing for animal welfare assessments. It's kind of a newer thing. Personally, I'm a big fan of the management system approach versus the checklist approach. By the checklist approach, you just end up asking a lot of, there's so many questions, and because every farm, every warehouse, every slaughter plant that you go to is different, you end up trying to fit that slaughter plant to meet those different yes/no statements in the checklist. So it becomes very difficult, and it's sometimes not very meaningful for the people that have had an audit and they're reading the report. And it's, you know, it's all been just sort of massaged so much that it's not very meaningful. So having a quality management system audit is much more, I mean, I like doing them better. I don't like checklists, but it's also for the person doing the getting audited, it's much better because I've actually looked at their system. I haven't really tried to make their system meet someone else's idea of what it's supposed to look like. But really, whatever your audit program looks like, whatever your audit tool looks like, really depends on the goals of your program. If you're really writing your program, you know, to meet some sort of goal that you have in mind versus just taking every standard and putting a question mark at the end of it. So, which still happens sometimes. So then we have our why we're measuring it. So our goal, we're meeting trade, or we want to niche market something. So we write our standards based on, we write our standard that, you know, animals need to have A, B, and C. So how are we going to go on a farm or in a slaughter plant or, you know, anywhere, a research facility, a pet store, and how are we going to measure things? So there's 3 ways to measure things in practical settings, right? So these are called resource-based measures, management-based measures, and animal-based measures. So those are RBMs, MBMs, and ABMs. So this is sort of the meat and potatoes of animal welfare assessment. So resource-based measures, these are prescriptions of the environment, right? So again, through research, sometimes through you know, trial and error. These are the things that in the resources that you give an animal in its environment that promote good animal welfare. So these are things like, you know, space requirements, stocking densities, how many feeders and drinkers, circulation of air, temperature requirements, etc. So these are resource-based measures. They're very easy to measure, right? So like, for example, we could all go out right now and I could say, oh, we could go to the dairy barn. I don't know where you guys are, but in Patho, but go to the dairy barn and go, let's measure the stalls and see if all the cows have a big enough stall. And we could give you a tape measure and we could measure those. So resource-based measures are in a lot of things. They're the language for a lot of programs and standards because they are very simple to measure and very simple for people to understand. They don't really need a lot of explanation. So they're very common. It'll say, you know, this many drinkers. And when you go do an audit, you know, I do an audit where I go and they say, oh, they all need, you know, you need one cow brush for 100 cows. So how many cows do you have? Well, you know, so it's really quite simple. So those are called resource-based measures. The second way is called management-based measures, and this is something really taken from food safety, where food safety program is just all protocols. So it's how you're going to chop your vegetables before your meat, etc. So for animal welfare, these are all protocols for you know, things like how do you deal with sick animals, which is a big one. You know, how do you identify and treat sick animals? When do you euthanize them? How, if you're on a pig farm, what's your process for castration? What are you using for pain medication? All those written protocols, all those records that verify that you're following your written protocols. You know, training records specifically is a one that's very, very common as well. So these are all called management-based measures. So these are the ones that farmers and people, unless you're in a plant where they have a QA person or a HACCP coordinator, they're all over this stuff. They really like it, and they'll just start pulling when you're doing an audit and you're saying, oh, I need this, and they'll take a big binder out that's about 6 inches big, and they'll go, you'll say, I need this, and they'll go right to the page. So, but farmers, other people, they sort of struggle with these sorts of protocols, or these sorts of measures, but they're really important for animal welfare assessment. But, you know, training records, SOPs are important because, you know, and I don't know if I had a nickel for every time I've talked to a farmer about this, you know, protocols are, SOPs are important for people that work on your farm or your slaughter plant, because it tells them what you want, how you want things to be handled, and they're going to do it the right way every time because it's written down and because you've trained them on it. So, you know, this is a hard thing. This having training, like formal training for people working in a lot of industries isn't really been very commonplace for the last, 100 and 200 years. So it's a hard one to kind of convince people to use until there's some sort of, customer complaint or an undercover video, and then all of a sudden, oh yes, let's train everybody. So it really is a good way to ensure that people know how to do things, especially for tasks that they don't do every day, right? So we often I do lots of training with the dairy industry about things like down cows, like, some people go 2 or 3 years without having a cow that's non-ambulatory that they have to deal with. So, they need a refresher. So they can go look at the SOP and it's all written out there. This is what we're supposed to do, instead of going online at that time and, doing a search to figure it out. So the thing about management-based measures, again, I could give you some protocols, some template protocols, and we could go out and look at protocols in the barn, and you could verify whether or not those management-based protocols, management-based measures are effective and appropriate. So those are animal-based or resource-based and management-based measures. Like, everyone's sort of familiar with those. They know how to do those. They're pretty straightforward. You don't need a lot of training. So that leads me into the third kind of measure that's very common and becoming more and more common, is the use of animal-based measures to go on a farm, a slaughter plant or whatever, a pet store, and say, look at the animals and say, based on the condition of the animals, I can say that, they have good welfare or they have poor welfare. So animal-based measures that are very common, of course, are body condition, right? Body condition needs a lot of training. We just did a project today in my class, which we're going to go out to the farm next week, and we'll see, it needs a lot of training. It's very time consuming. There's other things that are looking for. So really, when you do an audit, you're going on a farm and hoping you don't see any of these signs, because they're signs of pain and distress. So looking at lesion scores, lameness scores. There's some other sort of more behavior-focused animal-based assessments that are becoming more common. So those are looking at things like, bouts of feather pecking, novel object test, human-animal response tests that I'm seeing. So those people that have been in my class that know me, I love the novel object test. I'm doing that. I have a new dog and she's a bit fearful, so I'm doing lots of novel object testing with her to see if I'm getting trying to make her less fearful, which doesn't seem to be working. But anyway, so the novel object test is you put in a novel object and you kind of you time the response that it takes that animal to approach that novel object. So I'm seeing these kind of crop up into some of these assessments. So for example, I talked about the brush with cows. So not just that they have a brush, how many cows do you see using the brush within 15 minutes? So that's a nice animal-based measure to say, yes, there's a big lineup, and that's the animal-based measure. So they're becoming more popular. Of course, when I started doing my course in 13 years ago, it was very new and people were very afraid of them. Because they do take a lot more training. They also take, once you train someone to do like body condition, lameness or whatever, they also have to be recalibrated, because you get your training and then over time you either become more strict and more focused on what's acceptable, or you just become more lenient. So every 6 months we have when we do projects that we do or training that we do. So we do the in-person training, and then every 6 months we have to send them some pictures and videos and go, okay, let's recalibrate. This is a 1, this is a 2, this is a 3, etc. So it takes a lot more work. We cannot go out to the barn today and do a body condition score. Like, if we had a couple of hours, we could probably do a pretty good job of it, but it would take a lot of work, and there is a subjective aspect to it. So there's you go to a farm and they end up with below a threshold on one of these animal-based measures. It becomes quite a discussion over that. So the thing I wanted to make just really clear is that when we look at assessing animal welfare, so there's 3 kinds of measures, right? So but every standard can be measured by either one of those three ways. Usually in a program, so if I'm measuring, if I'm using one measure for something, I'm not going to use three measures for that. So I'm not going to look at the record, I'm not going to look at the SOP, and I'm not going to use the animal-based measure. So if I'm going to go to a farm and I'm going to do body condition, I'm not going to really care about anything about their feed, because I'm assessing their feeding program, which is, if you remember the 5 freedoms, they're supposed to have enough feed. I'm assessing that based on body condition. So I don't need to go and look at their feed records and see how much protein they're feeding or whatever. So it should be one of those programs. A lot of programs don't do that though. You have to look at their feed tags, and it's going on forever. So, but the standards, because I often see this and we talk about this in my class and in the literature, that an animal-based standard, even if you write it, you say you're writing a standard saying that all cows have to be body condition score 2, I can assess that through a record. I can assess that through, measuring how much feed space they have, but I can also measure that through their body condition. So these are just some other examples of, so thermal comfort, that's the standard, right? So I can measure that using an animal-based measure by looking at the animals, and are they shivering? If it's too cold, are they panting, or are they huddling if it's too cold? So, and again, that's something that, when we talk about humane transport, when we look at animals in transit, we look for open mouth breathing, and we go, if chickens are open mouth breathing, that's a sign of distress and we need to do something about it. That's an animal-based measure. But I could also measure that through resource-based, and that would just be looking at thermometer, right? Or looking at fans or heaters or whatever. And then manager-based measure, you could include in your protocol that I want someone to check the temperature every 3 hours. And then when I do my audit, I'm going to go and look at their record and go, yes, this person checked they check the temperature every 3 hours, right? So again, crowding is we want to have everyone has enough space, right? So animal-based measure, we can go and look at, are all the cows lying down, right? Are they don't have any lesions on them? Are they fighting over space? And then the resource-based measure would be to go and measure, 10 cows, 100 square feet, that's 1,000 square foot pen, very simple to do. Or I could look at, their plans, their building plans. Right, so I hope that's clear that whatever the standard says, you can use one of those 3 measures to measure animal welfare. It doesn't, the standard itself isn't animal-based or resource-based or manager-based. So when we look at programs, as I said, so some programs just look at resources. A lot of the early programs, and actually I still do some programs, it's just I go to the farm, I'm there for 3 hours. I spend 2 hours looking at records and SOPs. And then very little time looking at the animals, because it's an older program. It should probably be updated, but there weren't any sort of validated animal welfare, animal-based measures, and people were just really, really sort of resistant about doing that on farm. But really good programs have some resource-based measures. So some things I'm looking at the facilities, and I'm looking at the animals, and then they also need to have some good protocols. So a good example of that in a program is a euthanasia protocol. So you're never going to go to a farm and say, okay, pick an animal and euthanize it, right? I'm going to look at I'm going to ask them about their euthanasia protocol. I'm going to review their euthanasia protocol, and I'm going to verify that they're following their euthanasia protocol. I mean, I've been on farms where they've had to do euthanasia, so at that time, I don't need to look at their protocol. I can verify through observing how they do euthanasia. But that's a really good example of how, to do an assessment, to write an assessment program, you really need that record for some of these things that are, never going to be, if you had to be in a farm, like a dairy farm when they're calving, like you might have to live there for a month or so, to see a cow calf or something. So you need a program that has a nice balance of these things where they kind of make sense. The other thing about animal-based measures, which is interesting, is that, so you go to a farm or, a pet store or whatever, and you look at all the animals, and, say the threshold is that, you know, is 95% of the animals have to be in good body condition score, but you go and it's only 90% of them. So you've got 10% of the animals that have poor body condition score. When you do an animal-based measure, it doesn't really tell you why, right? So that's you. Then you would sort of follow that up by looking at, you know, looking at resources, looking at feeding points, looking at the quality of the feed, etc. And then you would look at management-based measures, like say that's when you would look at some of their feed slips and look for protein levels. So that's the one thing about animal-based measures. But if you're on a farm or, you know, in a pet store or whatever, and, you know, you're looking at, you know, their protocol says one thing, but you're looking at the animals and they're telling you something else, you're always going to defer to what the animals are telling you through that in that situation. So the animals based, they're the best indicators of welfare is looking at the animals. So when we have our program, we know why we have our program, we've developed our standards, we've got our different sort of measures, which are going to be a nice combination of animal-based, resource-based, etc. So really we want to go on the farm and basically an audit, an inspection. People always say, what's the difference between an audit or inspection? Well, an inspection is usually the government term for an inspection, and at the end of it, if you're not in compliance, you could lose your license, go to, you know, or be charged with some sort of regulation. Typically for an audit, you know, you're not in compliance. You a lot of these programs, as I mentioned earlier, are continuous improvement. So whoever it is, they have the opportunity to provide a corrective action, so fix that problem, and then they can be certified. In some cases, depending on if it's like a, you know, a niche market program, you don't comply with the program, you're not in the program, so you can't be part of that program. So it's I would say that has been a regulator for 33 years, very difficult to, you know, charge someone to get through the court system. I know with the provincial animal welfare system or provincial animal welfare services, that's the whole thing's been changed. But, you know, to kick somebody out of a industry program is a lot easier to do, a lot less red tape, etc. So, but that's sort of the difference. The both inspection and audit means we're going on a farm or going to a dog pound or whatever, and we're collecting evidence, right, to verify that they're meeting some sort of standard, whatever that standard is that we've developed. So how do we do this? So we call this Rover. Myself and Steve Roche from ACER, we do lots of training on this. So really, when you go on farm to do an inspection or an audit, you're reviewing documents, records, and, you know, SOPs and whatever else you can get your hand on. In a lot of programs that are sort of mature, you go to the farm, you go to the plant, and they'll just give you all sorts of binders, and you just sit and read through all the binders. I did audits for a program called Responsible Wool Standard, and some of those farms had like 3 or 4 big binders, so I'd have to go for a whole day and just read through their programs to kind of figure out what they were supposed to be doing before I could go out and sort of verify, yes, they're actually doing what they said they were doing. So yeah, so you review the documents, and then you know, observe the animals, the staff, if they're there, you know, if you're at a dairy farm and they're, you know, feeding calves, well, you want to be there where you can watch them feed calves to make sure that that they're doing what's in their program, and that, you know, after you've already verified that what's in their program, their written program anyway, meets the standards that the program is set out. Lots of times the observation will include interviewing people. So because you want to know that, because they probably have a training record that says, oh, we've been trained on this. So you want to ask them, oh, what does it say in your protocol? And then that's usually through interview, etc. So that, and then you're verifying through observation and interview, and then you're going to record everything. So we just call that Rover. So that it's just really collecting evidence that you're doing. You know, it's very CSI-ish. You know, looking for evidence that things are meeting that standard. So the inspections sort of the same thing. I found, like, when I worked for the government, because the regulations were sort of vague, a lot of the things were you know, much more, the scope of them wasn't really as established and set as it would be for an audit. So you really, when you go on farm to do an audit, you know, you have to keep, we call that being in scope, So that I'm here to do an animal welfare audit. So I'm not going to talk about your manure management system. I'm not going to talk about how dirty it is in your lunchroom, although I probably will anyway. But you know, I have to keep to the scope of my audit. Anyway, so I just wanted to spend a few minutes, which is kind of hard to do on Teams, looking at you know, just quickly look at one of these animal-based measures. So I picked like a really complicated one to start, and then I'll do an easy one. So I don't expect you to read this, but you know, this is this is a gate scoring system for birds, looking at a 0 score is normal, and a gate score of 5 is bad. So the animal's reluctant to move and unable to stand, right? So, and then it sort of goes from normal, and then the gate goes a little bit less. So I'm going to show you a video that I hope works, and then we'll look at the, so this is the little chicken. So then I'll put the, so now, you know, if I had the chat, I guess I could see whether or not, you know, what would you score that chicken as? So first of all, of course, you have to know what a normal chicken looks like when it's walking. So they sort of say its foot curls when raised. So are we going to score this as 1, 2, 3, 4? Definitely not a 5, right? Because it wasn't reluctant. That guy came up behind it to, you know, push it up so that we could verify that it was not reluctant to move. It moved away. So I don't know if you want to put that in the chat. I can't really see it, but that's, you know, that's a 0 to 5 system. So that's, you know, these are the sorts of programs or sorts of scoring systems that would be included in a poultry audit, right? Doing gate scoring. Look at another video and we can figure out where we would score this one. So that was a little bit easier, even though we haven't really done this before, right? Right, so we can see that, you know, this is a gate score of 4, right? So so this is a system that says 1 to 5, but they actually have a 0. So just to make it very more complicated. So what I find is when we're doing, when I'm teaching people and training people, and those of you that are in my class, I say this all the time, you have a scoring system with a lot of different categories. It's really hard to train people. And then you just keep arguing about it's a 1, it's a 2, it's a 2 or a 3. We spend so much time focusing on those, you know, those different, you know, sometimes very subtle differences, but really, does it really mean much? What does it mean to the bird, right? So, you know, I guess that's, you know, Ian Duncan was my advisor. I think about what's the bird feeling, right? It's really important about what's going on with the animal and what's we want these people to do with that information. So having thought about that and having worked a lot over the years training the SPCA and other folks, I worked with Gail Eckert, and I think she's on the call today. She would have been there, I'm sure, too, if the weather wasn't terrible. We developed what we call the stoplight system for assessing animal welfare. So we wanted to take all that discussion around if it's a 1 or it's a 2 and make it really simple, or not straightforward anyway, for first responders that are dealing with animal welfare issues, right? So so we've used the stoplight system. I guess we should call it a traffic light, somebody says, but anyway, so green is like animal looks good, no issues. Red, it's, you know, red is blood. It's not, it's in really poor welfare, experiencing poor welfare, and it needs immediate action. So when we do training, we can talk, that we can train people. This is what, you know, Gail's, of course, her expertise is in horses. This is what a normal horse looks like, or this is what a normal horse needs. And the red part of it, like what's poor welfare, a lot of those things are, you know, so obvious, especially with these calls, that they can identify those. So we spend most of our training on what it's supposed to look like, and then talk about all these things that are sort of in the middle. And, you know, so they're not immediate action required, but these are the things that we need to have follow up for these animals in, you know, in 7 days. So that's our stoplight system. So just give you a really brief, sort of view of what it would look like. And we did this with my class today. So apologize to my students that we've already done this. So again, under the red scoring system, these animals are very thin. They're very thin, they're emaciated, they need immediate attention. Animals that are in good condition, with lots of body fat cover, they're in great condition. That's good. That's what we want to see. But then any animal that's not it's not red, so it's not emaciated, but it's still thin. It's in the yellow region. So we don't need to worry about assigning this a 2 or a 2.5 or whatever. These animals still need some attention, maybe in the longer term than the red sort of animals. So if we look at animals like this, so could we score this, is this animal, is this a green, yellow, or red? So again, I can't see any of the responses, but I'm hoping you're saying this is a green. Animal looks good, has good body condition, then we can move on. This animal here, right? She's thin, right? She's emaciated. She needs immediate care. She's also got a big lesion, etc. This animal here as well. We don't have to argue, is she a 2.5 or 1.5? She's a red cow. She needs immediate attention. So this cow is somewhere in the yellow. She's not emaciated, but she's certainly on the lower end. She would need some attention. So that's sort of that's our stoplight system. So Gail and I have been working on that. Hopefully, as we go forward with the provincial animal welfare folks, that's how we're going to develop that training. So I just wanted to finish off by talking about sort of the first program that developed by Temple Grandin. It was developed for auditing animal welfare at slaughter plants. It really kind of took animal welfare assessment out of the lab and into the farm, into the slaughter plant. And her program is great because it's only 5 sort of control points, right? So it's very, very simple. But the beauty of it is that each one of these points tells us a lot about what's going on in the animals. And it's on all animal-based measures. It's a very simple program. So for each of these measures, there's 5 of them. You go to a plant, or I've adapted this for sale barns, etc. You look at 100 animals, and if we look at things like slipping and falling, which I'll show you a little video of that, you look at 100 animals, and if one of them slips, then they get 99%. If 5 of them slip, gets 95%. And so it's a really simple program with really easy statistics for you to use. But the other thing is, and I use this for all the years that I was doing, I was the Humane Standards Officer. I go to a plant, do an audit, and they go, well, what would be my score? And I go, well, you only got 60%. And everyone knows that 60% isn't very good. So they would, they totally understood what I was doing, and they would make improvements. And then I could go back and say, this time they got 90%. So they always would feel good about that, right? So, and then people that, they would get 100% on every audit criteria, they understood that they were doing a good job, right? Because they all know 100% is good. So it's very simple, but it's beautiful in its simplicity because people can relate to it. And, some of the programs I do, they'll be out of like 657, and I have to figure out the score, and they're like, it's just not relatable by most people. So again, we look at each criteria. We look at, it's a yes, no. So, we're looking at stunning, what renders the animal insensible. So it's either stunned or it's not stunned, right? So there's no in between. It's either yes or no. And then, part of the training to be able to audit to this program, of course, is lots of training on which effective stunning, what's it look like when you're measuring that. So again, very simple. You look at 100 animals and you get your score. It needs to be 100%. And in the program, it's 100. They all need to be rendered sensible 100% of the time. So again, we're looking at animals after stunning when they're bleeding. They must not be returning sensibility. Again, you look at 100 animals, being stunned. You looked at 100 animals being bled. You know, now we're up to 200 animals that I'm looking at. And then again, for electric prod use, the same sort of thing. We don't really use electric prod use anymore because most plants don't even use electric prods. But again, very simple. If someone uses a prod, it doesn't have to be turned on or anything. If they have a prod in their hand and they touch it to an animal, that's an electric prod use, yes or no. Very, very straightforward. So so the beauty of a lot of these, like, so the stunning, etc., tells you, you know, the effectiveness of it. That criteria tells you a lot about the equipment, how the person's trained, you know, are they patient? Are they, you know, do they understand their job? It tells you a lot about what's going on there, not only while you're doing the audit, but every day, because these criteria, like having good results, is not something that you can just do on the day of the audit. You need to be something that you need, that if you're working in a plant or, you know, handling animals at a sale barn or something, you need to be able to be doing this every day. So one of the other criteria is looking at slipping and falling. So on the left-hand side, this is a pig slipping and this is a pig falling. But again, you go to you watch animals unload or you watch animals being handled, and you're just counting how many pigs fall, how many pigs slip, right? They shouldn't be doing that very frequently. You look at 100 animals and you get your percentage. The other thing that we sometimes look as well is looking at vocalization. That's a little bit harder with pigs, but we definitely will do that with beef. And again, the animal vocalizes. I don't have to. You hear a cow moo, everyone can say yes, that cow mooed, and they don't really argue with you. So it's yes or no. So I just wanted to finish off and just with this video, and I think it has loud music on it. You know, just kind of an example of how you would score. We'd have a little clicker and we can score these animals being unloaded for the desert here. I can get rid of that. This is just off YouTube, but you can see how simple this is, just to stand and watch and measure these animals being unloaded. So yeah, so that's, I mean, that's very, you know, oversimplified, but there I have 7, and I would just stand there until I got 100, you know, counted up to 100, and end up with my score. So a really nice program, a really nice setup there they have with a non-slip floor, because as I said, with these animal welfare programs, you know, with her program, one of those criteria really measures a lot of different things. So, you know, and just to kind of finish up, when we talk about animal welfare assessment programs, I sort of mentioned that at the beginning with a lot of these programs, industry driven programs, you know, I think that continuous improvement, you manage what you measure. I think these programs, they inform producers, they inform people, you know, and I think people are inherently want to do a good job, but they also want to do, like, they want to pass and they want to get a good score. So I think they've done a lot to really to improve animal welfare.